Well, welcome everyone. So we've got an exciting panel coming up now with a maybe somewhat controversial and definitely topical conversation around the CeFi Unwind and what it means for DeFi moving forward. My name's Joe from Maple Finance, so we're an institutional lending protocol. And then joining me, we've got Will, CEO and co-founder of Element Finance. We've got Piers, CEO of RDX Works. And we've got Do. So maybe guys, just to kick off, if you want to give a couple of minute overview of what it is your products do, the problems that you're solving, and maybe something on your background as well.
Yeah, so I used to be an ETH2 researcher before going into DeFi. Me and my co-founder played a big part in a lot of the things involved in the merge. Some other aspects with what you see has sort of come in the latest developments on ETH2. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Element Finance. Element Finance is essentially a yield stripping tool. So we take different yield positions in the market. Let's say like Maple Finance as an example that provides yield on the lending side. And we split that into two basic pieces. This is the principal that you put down and then the interest that you earn. So if I put $1 million in on the lending side, that's $1 million in principal. Any interest earned over the next 6 months, let's say, or a year, 10%, that would be collectible through these interest tokens, which are $100,000 in this case. And this enables a lot of interesting things. In particular, it allows us to take different variable positions in the market. We can boost the APY on top of that because we're essentially issuing these trading markets that are on these like interest tokens, variable side, but are also on the fixed rate side, which are these principal tokens. So we essentially facilitate fixed rate and variable interest markets that have a number of different pieces of utility with them. But yeah, that's the general overview on that. It allows as well a lot of people to be able to leverage into the interest on the variable side. And as a side effect, this sort of creates more conservative fixed rate instruments that are really good for treasuries, DAOs, institutions, people who are sort of hedging against interest rate drops, such as we saw recently in this aftermath. So, yeah.
Cool. So I'm Piers Ridyard, CEO of RDX Works. RDX Works is a core developer of the decentralized finance protocol Radix. Radix is a layer 1 protocol focusing specifically on decentralized finance. It launched about a year ago, has a market cap of around $600 million. And we spent the last 3 years focusing in on a problem that we actually see in the crypto space universally, which is that it's basically really difficult to get developers building DeFi applications and Web3 applications. It's really difficult to get developers in the space because Solidity and the EVM are really unintuitive, difficult things to build with. And we still see huge amounts of hacks and exploits even after 2 or 3 years of building these kind of technologies. So what we did is we created a programming language called Scripto, which came out of the development with working with almost 1,000 DeFi developers and projects to get to something incredibly intuitive and incredibly safe to build with. That launched in December. It already has over 3,000 developers in the community. And today it went live on AlphaNet. And so you can now actually deploy test programs, test DeFi applications on top of Radix Ledger, which will then be going live on the mainnet next year.
Yeah. Good to see everyone. I see many kind of friends and familiar faces. So for StableNode, we help with the different governance, including, for example, Optimism, MakerDAO, and many others. And also beside StableNode, I'm also with a Maker as well, and then I'm helping as a delegate, so helping with the governance and proposals. So nice to meet everyone.
Okay, great. And so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but obviously it's been well hyped, the crash of CeFi, but it has also been combined with some crashes on the DeFi side. We're all very familiar with Luna. And so wanted to get your guys' reflection on why it happened, but less maybe on the risk management side, and then that we know was abused, and more around the reflections that you guys have taken from it, and maybe some of the strategies that you had to implement in order to manage things for your protocols and the projects that you're working on.
Yeah, I would say like at Element Finance, we never used any yield sources in the Terra Luna ecosystem. I think because when we were doing basic analysis on economic analysis on whether these things could be sustainable, we found that it clearly couldn't. So I think a lot of these, there were strong signals in that direction if you sort of just looked into it a bit deeper. I think that's one of the reasons why our platform has, generally maintained its safety, and it's sort of reconfirmed, when we look at different yield sources, we look at different attempts and approaches, is to continue to do that due diligence that we've been doing. That's sort of our takeaway. Yeah.
I think there's two things. Like on the CeFi side, there's clearly been a proving out of the importance of transparency. I like what you guys do with Maple and what you guys would do with Element. Have the ability to actually lend out to counterparties and not have that as a black box and have that on ledger has huge advantages, and you guys not having massive amounts of defaults versus things like 3AC and stuff like that is testament to that. However, DeFi has its own set of problems, which is basically hacks and exploits. We've kind of taken it as the cost of doing business, that sometimes these programs get exploited for billions of dollars, and that kind of seems unsustainable as well. So I think that there's a wholesale shift, both in understanding that transparency can lead to better lending practices and more sustainable yield, and that you don't need to build Ponzi schemes to be able to build something sustainable in the DeFi space. But there is also the fact that the entire industry has a problem with hacks and exploits, which really needs to be addressed for the next cycle. And that's the big thing that Radix is working on. And I hope to see in the next cycle that we're going to be moving away from technologies that tend to cause these kind of hacks and exploits in the first place.
Yeah, I would say that especially those recent exploits as well as the incidents has kind of shown that within both crypto as well as traditional field as well as CeFi field have been very interconnected. And then especially what we saw was that not just this issue of transparency, but also the fact that liquidity was also not there, and a lot of times it was kind of locked. And so even if they want to solve their issues, they realize, for example, they put it in a different CeFi partners like 3AC or Celsius that also made the problem worse. So we definitely saw the industry became more interconnected. And for better or worse, they also meant that when there's an incident like this, the impact gets greater as well.
Yeah, and Piers, maybe given you are launching or announcing the launch today, can you talk to how you're balancing that transparency element that is so important and what DeFi really does enable with the protection against hacks and security exploits?
Yeah, I mean it's a relatively technical area. I think one of the problems that we do in the way we build blockchain technologies today, the way we build smart contracts, is that everything on top of something like the EVM or something like in a DeFi contract is essentially the ledger itself doesn't understand what these assets are, right? So if you create a ERC20 contract, you're actually defining not just the token, but a balance of tokens as well. So you're not relying on the ledger keeping track of balances, you're relying on this contract keeping track of balances. And so everything that happens on top of Ethereum or Solana or Avalanche is just basically message passing between smart contracts that is actually the root cause of a large amount of these errors that end up happening because of all of the checking that has to be done in how these smart contracts work together. On Radix, what we do is we make the resources, the assets that you care about, a native function of the ledger, and then you end up being able to be much more secure in how you can handle asset transfers because the ledger actually understands what it's handling. So the ability to have things like reentrancy and recursion, the ability to actually make mistakes where you don't update one balance in one smart contract but do in another and end up accidentally transferring to someone. All of these kind of things can be abstracted away from the user, and you can create much more secure DeFi applications as a result of just changing the way you architect something. And it's a wholesale thought process where you completely adjust what you are using the ledger for, where you're saying, look, we now know that DeFi is product market fit for a huge part of crypto. Let's make these ledgers understand what assets are so that then we can build much more simple smart contracts around them instead of having to do all of this boilerplate just to define what the hell it means to be a token every single time you create a token or an NFT or something like that. So our thesis is actually start again from scratch in how you actually define assets on top of a public ledger and create a much simpler programming language around that treats those as native features of the language, which is, radical from the point of view of nothing that has been created in Solidity is compatible with something like Radix. But once you get started, the intuitiveness means that you're able to build something like Uniswap or Aave very, very quickly. And we think those kind of tools, not only of the fact that it makes it more secure to build, but also makes it way easier to get developers into the space, right? Like getting a developer up to the speed to understand how all of this message passing and error checking and all that kind of stuff happens on top of Ethereum is really hard. Whereas if you can give people more intuitive tools, we can get more talent into the space and make it easier to build the incredible next generation of DeFi that is necessary to create more transparency on Ledger around more sophisticated financial products than we have today.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think, once you've got more developers coming into the space, and whether they're existing developers in banks or other financial institutions that don't have to learn Solidity or can interact with things more easily in languages and things that they understand, then product development comes and more participation, hopefully.
Developers are the prerequisite for innovation in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And so would love to hear your thoughts on everyone talks about the highlights that the crash has had between the transparency elements of CeFi and DeFi, but what are you seeing in terms of the other things that have been highlighted from this crash and what this means for DeFi in terms of learnings that we can take moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of learnings. So I think Piers touched on one, which is definitely being much more careful in auditing, the smart contracts that you have. Auditing is not just isolated to bugs in the code, right? It's also, does this work as an economic system? Like, does this scale? What type of vulnerabilities does this particularly have, right? When you look at basically the crash and everything that happened, CeFi sort of, I think there is a lot of incompetence there. If you did basic economic analysis, you could see that, well, these stable coins are being propped up artificially. This is not a sustainable method to go. So I think it brought a lot more attention to just being much more open as far as does this system work? Does it scale? I think there's a lot more caution now. As a result, I think there's going to be a lot more trust with teams that take security very seriously, do economic analysis on things, simulations at scale. I think a lot of this would have been avoidable if there was good simulations at scale. I think that is going to now be a much more important part of DeFi and everything in general. I also think it sort of begins separating some of the CeFi and DeFi systems as well. I think Terra Luna is an example of DeFi gone bad, and then we sort of saw CeFi gone bad, and you sort of saw what was left in the trenches is DeFi good, the things that sort of maintain themselves. And so this is a really good build cycle. You sort of saw after the crash in 2017 into 2018, 2019. You saw a lot of productivity during this period and a lot of learnings from everything that occurred. And so I'm generally optimistic. I think safety, security is a huge learning through this. I think due diligence, having a strong team, lessening the hype, and having a bit more attention to simulations and data in general before launching a product is the learning. Because you can't really, when you have billions of dollars going through a system, one of the things that you have to be careful about, that's a bit different than normal tech is the concept of build fast, break fast, right? In this case, when you have lots of funds going through things, you need to be a bit more diligent. So yeah,
got it. And as you and I are the only non-technical people on this stage now, what are your thoughts around the opportunity for DeFi in the real world? I know you work a lot, obviously, with Maker, and there's been a lot of discussion around real-world assets, how we can or can't bring them into the DeFi ecosystem. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that's going to progress and how we can accelerate that.
Yeah, I mean, especially at the beginning stage of DeFi, a lot of interest for working with institutions was potentially taking advantage of DeFi's very high yield, especially back then, like DeFi summer, yields can be 8 to even 12%. I mean, Anchor, when it was functional, was 20%, right? So that was kind of the thesis that maybe we can bring those CeFi and also institution into DeFi to take advantage of it. But then especially recently with what's happening, that a lot of yield on DeFi has been very low. So it makes more sense for them to borrow from, for example, using DeFi has been something that a lot of different, like for example, Aave, as well as Maker, and others have been kind of pushing for. Maker itself also have been, for example, working with different banks in both US, Europe, and others to trying to provide loan. Most recent was the SocGen, which is the French bank. We provide over 100 million, DAI, which was converted to dollar and then converted to euro. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I do think that especially for now, because of what's happening with the inflation and there's the US Treasury, it just doesn't make so much sense for them to deposit into DeFi. Have to go through all the risks just to get like 1%, 2%. So I think it makes more sense for them to be able to use the system to basically borrow cheap. So I think that's the way that a lot of them are going.
I think it's really interesting how you define it as sort of a reversal. Before it was sort of bringing it into DeFi because the rates were really high, right? 20%, like yield is incredible. Yield is like dropped and dried up significantly. And so now it's sort of this opposite. Like, how do you bring these like real world assets into DeFi? Because there's a lot of innovation behind DeFi once you take that as collateral. Once you take those real world assets, so a lot of the things you can do, you can have a stability module for DAI, you can, a number of things. And so, real world assets, I think, is particularly interesting there. You sort of add the innovation cycle of DeFi, but you have sort of the deep liquidity of, what's in the real world. But I really like how you mentioned the reversal. It's really interesting.
Yeah, and you're seeing it more and more with the yields that have now gone so low. Like, institutions are now looking at it and going, "Hey, that looks great. I'd like to tap into that market." And like the MakerDAO way of lending, I'm seeing more and more people who are looking at that and going, "Yeah, we'd like a $10 million, $20 million, $50 million line of credit." Because there's all of these lenders that have these revolving, like, so if you think about payday loans, or if you think about credit that like sort of buy now pay later companies, right now their lines of credit don't work for what they need, because they basically need to be able to borrow, lend, and then turn around and borrow immediately on that in a very quick way and quite a granular way. And mostly the financial markets are all about these long-term instruments. So you go out and you raise a $100 million bond, and then you're paying interest on that for 5 years. And you've got to use that $100 million over that course of that period. Whereas what DeFi is presenting is this ability to get much more flexible financing for debt instruments that actually appeal much more to the kind of financial products that you're seeing growing up in the Web 2 space, in the fintech space, such as things like Klarna and stuff like that. So I think that we're going to see a lot more of that, of companies that are sort of web first, much faster moving in terms of lending, very good credit ratings, but can't match their lending and borrowing, their financing and lending books well enough in the traditional space, and are coming to crypto to be able to get much more flexible financing than is available from a bank.
Yeah, agree. So go ahead, Will.
Yeah, I was going to say, although stablecoin yields have significantly dried up, I think ETH yields are actually not that bad. And so sort of when people, the markets sort of begin to drop, and people are looking at coming back in and bringing capital back into ETH, sort of the more volatile versus the stable assets, there are yield opportunities there, and that ends up being like really good for an entrance into this space. And then if you also look at compounding gains as if you're long ETH in the long term, that sort of increases further. So we're also in this shift from like stable coin yields dried up to sort of more volatile asset yields will now sort of be the norm. And so there's sort of interesting ways in DeFi, by the way. I did like a post on this called Decollateralized, where you can like get exposure to, let's say, ETH yield while still holding on to stables. And I think this is a whole interesting area to explore as well.
Okay. And obviously there's been large drop-offs in TVL for DeFi, close to 95%, and so a big impact. And so I think, is there been any reflections from you guys when you're thinking about it for your protocols? One, how you're going to drive liquidity, because in the end we can build all these fancy things and they can be fantastic, but if there's no money circulating through it, then it doesn't really matter. And any lessons we can take from the CeFi guys that have been able to track a huge amount of liquidity into their protocols, and whether we need to be thinking about the right balance between capital markets, sales, and those elements of it, the commercial sides of DeFi protocols and not just pure technical.
Yeah, so I have an interesting take on this. I think one, it's sort of finding the good yield sources. I also think even low yield on leverage can be great yield. So this is something that we've sort of been playing with. So we're working on like a V2 and sort of prioritize like a dual-sided leveraging market that's actually sustainable, and then also looking at like strong, good, what we consider sustainable yield sources such as Maple. By the way, we're huge fans of Maple. Excited to integrate with them. It's really cool what you all have done. So that's sort of my take on that. Yeah.
I think that I think basically we're now going into a build cycle like we do every 4 years, and there's going to be a question of where yield is coming from for the next cycle. I don't know that that's clear yet. I think that a lot of what we're focusing on is giving people safe places and abilities to be able to play with as many different business models as possible, including looking more at regulated finance. So one of the things that we built is something called Instapass, which is a AML KYC compliance stack that you can use with your platform to be able to create more easily an experiment in, for example, regulated yield farms or something like that. Now, the reason that I'm hesitant to say this is where yield is going to come from. It's clearly going to be coming from more sophisticated sources. It's clearly going to be coming from sort of more like I was talking about before, sort of like traditional credit markets, traditional bond markets, like places, money market funds where people are looking for being able to more granularly match the kind of product types that they need. But ultimately, I think we're going to be going through a period of working out how to build these new product types on top of public ledgers. And there's going to be a bunch of experiments, there's going to be a bunch of failures. And I think that's what this time is for. So mostly what we focus on is making bridging into protocols as easy as possible, with as many asset types as possible, making it as easy as possible for DeFi developers to add on things like regulation to their platform, and making and focusing on educating the next generation of DeFi builders, as specifically getting as many of those from the traditional finance space as possible, so that they can be bringing in their own learnings of how they've been building in the traditional finance space. But ultimately, I think that this is going to be a hard, 1-2 year period of working out what the next way of building a scalable, yield generating platform is. And, what you guys are doing with Maple, for example, with market makers and stuff like that, that's clearly good sources of yield, but it needs to expand beyond our market as it is today. And yeah, that's going to be a lot of experimentation and failure before we work out what that looks like.
Yeah. And I think, one of the big benefits coming out of it is that hopefully we get out of these Ponzonomics, tokenomic inflationary rewards being the underlying yield source, and that we never return to that model again. It should be sustainable, repeatable yields that are driving DeFi moving forward. Did you have any further thoughts, Stu?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that it happens in different cycles. And then I think we're definitely in this cycle where liquidity is very thin. And although it might be unpopular, that we might have to go through the period where different DeFi protocols have to consolidate. We already saw some of the partners go bankrupt, but I think that we have to realize that even DeFi protocols, they eventually need to pay for operations and others, and many of them won't be able to survive the bear market if it lasts longer. So I think they will have this period where a lot of protocols, especially if they're not competitive, because we've seen so many of them copy-paste, right? So there are too many copy-paste projects that we're going to see a lot of those that kind of lack the innovation. They'll probably die out, and the liquidity will get a little bit consolidated, and they will have another potential market expansion. It's kind of my thinking.
Yeah, I agree. I think liquidity will be back, and there's going to be something that's going to move the market again. We go through these natural cycles. They tend to shorten each time, but I love the move on more sustainable yield, and there's a lot of things on that. There's RWAs, lending systems that make sense. I think even just like core validator positions, right? Like you look at something like staked ETH or on other core layer 1 chains that come out. Validator positions is a huge part. MEV extraction. I actually think that'll sort of just merge in with like validator positions as a whole. But yeah, I think those are some cool things that'll come out of it as well. But I agree, cycles. I think the liquidity will come back. It's just we're in the beginnings of a despair cycle, right?
Yeah. And so maybe with the last few minutes we have left, we're sitting here, TOKEN2049 in 5 years' time. What do we think the state of crypto finance is going to be? Will CeFi exist? And what will be the balance, if it does, between CeFi and DeFi and the broader crypto finance economy?
Yeah, I think DeFi is going to massively innovate over the next couple of years. It always does in a bear. I think we're going to see some crazy things we don't expect. I think CeFi will ultimately sort of transform into regulated DeFi. So like the core underlying nature of protocols underneath are sort of, they don't have an opinion. They're not necessarily, controlled by KYC or regulated entities. But then you can basically build wrappers on these systems that do give access from a regulated perspective for institutions and banks to touch. Because like if you look at this last like bull run, for example, you've never seen a time in like the financial system where like a 16-year-old kid in his like parents' basement could like write up a financial application that gets like billions of dollars going through it. And like it's dangerous, but it's also innovation. And so that innovation's moving. It's going to continue to move. And then it's sort of just figuring out how to wrap that and connect that to CeFi through regulated systems.
Yeah, I think that the big thing that's going to shift for these platforms is going to be options and derivatives are going to be really core to how you build more and more sophisticated products. So I think in 5 years' time, you're going to see serious volume on options and derivatives that allow you then to create more and more sophisticated and granular financial products. The other thing I think you're going to see is the concept of a weighted book of risk from the point of view of an individual. So right now what we do is we go, okay, you want to get a yield on your Ether, then lend out your Ether. You want to get a yield on your USDC, then lend out your USDC. When actually what you should think about is a balance sheet of assets. And if you can create risk models that work around balance sheets of assets, then you can do much more sophisticated things about things like rehypothecation or prime brokerage or things like that, which is going to, again, lead to this ability to create more and more sophisticated financial products that end up looking more and more like the world that we see today. So I think that in 5 years' time, it's quite likely that DAOs will look increasingly like they have balance sheets like banks, even though they won't be called banks, and that those DAOs will be able to do sophisticated things within DeFi that allow them to generate yield for their in the holders of the DAOs, but use the financial products that are available, such as derivatives and options, as well as more sophisticated yield sources, to be able to create blended products that increasingly look like financial institutions.
Yeah, I actually think that they will be working in a parallel, because I do think that there will be more sophisticated product, but we're also going to see actually products that's very easy for people to use, that they don't even realize that it's blockchain in a way. Like we already seen compared to, for example, 2017 or 16, like some might remember Ether Delta or like even early version of Maker. It was very difficult to use, but then now it's much easier. And I can imagine that we're gonna have people who are like using for, like people who are able to understand and use it. And then we have people who are basically like, basically DeFi becomes part of their life and they don't even realize it. I think it's kind of my vision, and I think that, kind of my thinking in the future.
Certainly hope so, Joe. So that brings us to the end of the panel. Big round of applause for our guests.